Hey, I'm Jess Lupini, and this is The Words Don't Fit the Picture, the show where we untangle the strange and fascinating relationship between gender, voice, and identity. When I first started making this show, I knew I was going to talk about how we can change our voices through things like voice therapy, surgery, and hormones, and why we might want to change our voices, reasons like dysphoria or safety. But there was something else I wanted to explore, something that's a little harder to quantify and something that I wasn't totally sure where to start looking for. And that was what's going on in our minds and in the world that causes us to perceive different voices differently. When you hear a voice on a podcast or on the phone, what causes you to form the mental picture of the person speaking that you see in your head? Why that particular person with those features and that gender? Turns out there's a field of study that looks at exactly this: sociolinguistics. So, I'm here today with Dr. Kathryn Campbell-Kibler, an associate professor of linguistics at Ohio State University. Thanks so much for joining us, Kathryn.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be joining you.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. The first question is either a very easy question or a very hard question, depending on your perspective, I guess. What is sociolinguistics?
So sociolinguistics is actually a very broad term that refers to lots of different fields. So at the broadest level, it just means the study of the relationship between language and all the other social stuff. So obviously language is social stuff, but we're interested in how it connects to all the rest of it. In my particular corner of sociolinguistics, what we're interested in is what you were just describing. So how do we make meaning out of language variation? So variation in how we say things, whether that's pronunciations or word choice or sentence structure. How do we make social meaning, make differences between people, make connections, do all of our day-to-day social work with that stuff?
When I was developing the idea for this podcast, I had this list of 8 big questions I wanted to answer. And one of the toughest ones is, of course, the one I want to talk to you about today, which is, what do people assume about a person from the sound of their voice alone? What does that make you think about?
Yeah, so we have a lot of stuff that we learn about each other from voices. Some of it is about who we think someone is. So that might be some of what we think of as like the big demographic categories like race or gender or age. Some of that is situational, right? So we're trying to understand each other's hidden meanings or the emotions that somebody's feeling, right? We track a lot of different stuff through language use. We don't really know what the full range is, but most of the stuff that somebody's set out to find out, like, is this something that people can learn from language? Usually the answer seems to be, yeah, people are really tuned into that. We're very hungry. Our minds are very hungry for information about other people. And so we tend to grab onto everything that we can during an interaction to try to like track what's happening and, what should I be doing in this situation?
Right. And I imagine some of that information is probably really accurate or useful, and some of it is maybe not so accurate.
Yeah. So early on in the study of this kind of perception, there was a real focus on accuracy, right? Like, what can you tell? In fact, the first speaker evaluation study is from the 1930s in the UK, and they actually played people's voices over the BBC radio and then invited the listeners to write in letters with their guesses about anything they could tell about the people. And they compiled the research that way. So they were really focused on like, what did people get right? And they were really good at it, right? So they didn't necessarily know exactly what someone's job is, but, they heard somebody who held a high position in the military and they said, he's used to telling people what to do, right? Like, so they can get a lot of these kinds of details. But then as it went on, we realized the accuracy, especially for personality stuff, is really hard to judge, right? Like, what's the gold standard for whether somebody is authoritative or friendly or intelligent? Like, what counts, right? And so we've shifted gears from a sense of like, well, are people doing it right? And more looking at what is it in the language cues that trigger particular perceptions, right? So one of the the early sort of developments in what we call the gay speech literature. So this sort of obsession with, what is it that makes some men sound gay, right?
Hmm.
A big development of that was realizing that people were very bad at actually telling somebody's sexual orientation, but they were pretty good at agreeing with each other, right? So somebody's response is likely to look like somebody else's response. The listeners tend to agree on which talkers sound gay and which ones don't, even if they're not very good at actually saying anything about the actual
Okay.
reality of those people, right?
So you mean that like people who were participating in these studies were all in agreement about which voices they thought sounded gay, but the voices they thought sounded gay didn't necessarily correlate with the people who actually were.
Exactly, exactly. So it's there's this other thing that's called sounding gay, and that's its own entity, which is, not completely unrelated to people's lived experiences, but doesn't match up with it, doesn't match up with sexual orientation, right?
It's fascinating to me that sounding gay, which you would assume is very strongly correlated to being gay, is actually its own totally different thing. What other aspects of how people talk are kind of their own category, where sounding like the thing is not actually related to the thing?
This happens actually kind of a lot, right? So I'm working on writing up a paper right now where I look at how people are picking up on race cues in speech. So there's a tremendous amount of variation in how people are heard that doesn't match in for stuff like race, for stuff like gender, for stuff like sexual orientation. People are actually quite good at age. There seem to
Okay,
be
interesting.
physiological changes in the vocal tract that people are pretty good at picking up on. So, they're not like down to the year, but sort of in broad swaths, people are pretty good at age. But a lot of stuff, again, it often correlates, but it's not tapped in some kind of automatic way to people's lived reality. The main relationship, well, there's a few, right? So one is you learn to talk from the people that you're around. So for that aspect of things, particularly in terms of stuff that runs in families, right, or communities, you pick up from sort of who you grew up with. And then the other thing is if you don't sound like people think you should sound based on who you are, that can create problems for your life. And so then you're likely to want to do things about that, and so that in itself creates a pressure that ups that correlation, right, between those features, because we have an incentive to want that to make sense to other people.
Okay, so could you talk a bit more about that study that's looking at race and voice
Yeah, so
that you were referring to?
there's a bunch of existing work on the topic. John Baugh is like the big name in this area of linguistic profiling. And he has a very well-known study from about 20 years ago where he showed that people could judge racial guises. So it was all him. The stimuli were all him. It wasn't different people, but he was able to produce uh, some version of his own voice that sounded African American, that sounded white, and that sounded Chicano. And from those guises, it took less than a second of speech for people to make those judgments, right? So he would play people the word hello, and they would be able to be like, oh, that person's black, that person's white, that person's Chicano.
Did you say
Uh,
less than a second?
Less than a second of speech, yeah.
So that's so fast for somebody to make a judgment of race from the
Yeah.
voice alone.
Yeah, it goes and it's very fast in terms of how fast they're processing, and it's also just not very much material, right? There's just not a lot of speech that's happened. And I was seeing the same thing. So I'm essentially replicating that work, but just trying to see if we can use an eye tracking method. So a computer that is looking at where somebody's eyes are looking. So we give them a bunch of faces, and then again, they're just listening to the beginning of a recording. And for us, we're seeing a little bit more than a second, their eyes shift and start looking they start sorting by race in terms of which potential speakers they think they're seeing. So the task is
Okay.
look at these faces, listen to the person, and click on who you think is talking. And their eyes start showing that pattern of distinguishing by race a little bit more than a second in, and it takes about 200 milliseconds to go from I'm going to move my eyes in a place to hello, Your Majesty.
We've both got our cats running around in the background. I saw mine was jumping and running up there.
All right.
It happens. Let's talk about gender then. How does the process of guessing at somebody's gender based on the sound of their voice, or maybe guessing is the wrong word that implies kind of an intentionality or a conscious process, but what is that process of recognizing gender when someone is speaking? What does that look like?
Yeah, I like guessing. I think it's a great description because I think it underlines the fact that you can't tell someone's gender from their voice unless their voice is saying what their gender is at you, right?
Yeah.
Then it'll work. But people do guess, right? They do make judgments about what they think is happening. And there's a few different ways that there things that they might be going on, right? So probably one of the fastest has to do with what we call formants. So that's an acoustic measure that we can make of somebody's voice that relates to the length and shape of their vocal tract. So the vocal tract is the space basically between your lips and your larynx. And that's where a lot of the action happens in terms of making speech sounds, right? And so if somebody's larynx has been exposed to testosterone, either going through a sort of naturally occurring puberty as a young person, or later on if they take exogenous testosterone, then their larynx is going to get bigger and it's going to drop lower in the throat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that has an effect. So that it getting bigger will change the fundamental frequency of their speech, and dropping lower in the throat will make the vocal tract bigger. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one of the big cues that people often go by, because it does make a pretty big difference in terms of the acoustic quality of the speech. And it's something that's going to happen, just like I was saying about age and voice quality. It's something that kind of happens throughout almost everything, all the sounds that somebody's producing. So you're going to be able to pick up on it very quickly. So that I think is one of the big things that people use, but it's not the only thing. There's a lot of other stuff that people have more control over that can influence perceptions of gender. And people tend to produce them in order to sort of exaggerate gender differences. So there's really old work from the 70s showing that you get fundamental frequency differences in the speech of children at like 5 to 7 years of age, right? So this is way before any physiological differences are happening. There's no larynx effect in this situation.
Yeah.
5-year-olds don't have a difference in their larynxes, but they have learned already that fundamental frequency, the pitch of your voice, informally, is something that carries gendered meaning. And so they're already starting to pull their performances apart. They're starting to make those differences just in the manipulation of how they use their larynxes, just like the rest of us can. We have a physical possible range of our fundamental frequency, but we can decide where in that to live.
So we're seeing kids way before there's an age where we're starting to see a physical difference, still exhibiting those like learned differences between how different genders speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that right? Yeah. Okay, that is so interesting. How does that process of learning how people around you speak and like adopting that, how does that actually work?
We kind of don't know. It's
Okay.
actually really interesting. Well, if you're a linguist, it's really interesting. So we know that perceiving other people's language use is obviously crucial to doing your own language use, right? Particularly for babies. Like they have to perceive other people's language use,
Right.
and that's how they learn language, right? So obviously there's what we call the perception production loop, right? There's some kind of, you learn to perceive other people's language and then that informs what you do. But it's not a perfect loop, because otherwise every time we talked to anybody with a different accent than ours, we would immediately switch over completely to their accent. And there is a pull
Yes.
in that direction. There's something we call accommodation or convergence, where we tend to pick up some things about other people, but we don't go all the way, right? And sometimes we don't even go there at all. And there's sort of complicated social stuff about when and how we do that. So we don't really know very much about where the sort of blocks and openings are in that loop, for how we learn those things. There's got to be a lot of action happening in terms of how people respond to us. Particularly, you can see this with little kids, right? Where they're really licensed, and teenagers, right? They're really licensed to try out new selves, new versions of themselves. And sort of socially, that's considered normal. It's developmentally appropriate behavior for them to try sounding different ways. And we can sort of pick up on how that goes.
What is semiotics?
So semiotics is about meaning and how people develop systems of meaning, right? And so we might take a particular linguistic feature, and say, okay, well, what does this mean? So in gender, when we talk about gender and perceptions of gender, everybody's favorite one is S, right? We love to talk about S, and we talk about fronting S and backing S. And when you're not a linguist, people still talk about it. They talk about the gay lisp, right? And they want to understand the gay lisp. So this is one of those features that people really associate with gender, and linguists have done a ton of work on it, right? So there's a lot of different interpretations about what a fronted S, for example. So as fronted instead of a s is the middle, or sh as a backed S, right? These, depending on where you put your tongue when you make the S sound, it's going to make a sort of a different quality. It's going to change the acoustic signature of the sound.
So a fronted S is where your tongue is more near the front of your mouth, and a backed S is where it's further back. Okay,
So,
great. Got it.
exactly. So if you say S and kind of hold it, you can kind of feel where the closest part of your tongue to the roof of your mouth is, like where that smallest point is, and exactly where that is on the roof of your mouth is going to shape what the S sounds like. And the further front it is, so the closer to your teeth, the higher frequency it's going to be, and the further back it is, the lower frequency it's going to be.
Okay.
And across a bunch of languages, not all of them, but most of the languages that anybody has checked, there's an association with the front or higher frequency S as being associated with femininity, and the backer S as being associated with masculinity, with a lot of complexity hidden in that statement. That is not always true. But broadly speaking, it's sort of the most common pattern. Because it's not always true, that's where you see these semiotic disconnects kind of emerging sometimes, where some people are going to interpret that S as meaning a particular thing, and other contexts in another community, maybe it's going to be interpreted differently.
Okay, so that gives me another question about this sort of gay voice thing in the first place, which is if sounding gay is not strongly correlated to being gay, why do we think it is as a society?
I think it's because as a society, we're not great at thinking about the differences between and the relationships between gender and sexual orientation, and also just kind of different aspects of gender, right? So when people talk about sounding gay or the gay lisp, part of what they're doing is saying, this is somebody who sounds feminine. And if he's a man and he sounds feminine, all I've got is that he's gay. Like that's the only version I've got, right? And not again, with the semiotic systems, not everybody has a model that sort of connects those two things in that way, right? But I think the concept of the gay lisp or of gay speech comes from that assumption, right? And I mean, a lot of that is sort of a bit older, right? The gay speech literature was kind of labeled that in the late 90s, when it was still really new and exciting to have work on gay stuff that was being carried out by gay linguists, right?
Yeah.
Because the absolute earliest stuff on that we would now put in the gay speech literature was speech language pathologists in, the 1960s saying some men sound feminine. We should figure out how to fix them, right? So I'm going to do an acoustic study of like what makes them sound feminine so that so then like the speech language pathologist can like train them out of it, right?
Oh
Like
my gosh.
that's where that original literature started, right? So by the
Yeah.
90s, having white cis gay men saying, I'm going to study what makes other white cis men sound gay or not, like
Mm.
that was a big step forward. That was really exciting, right? But it was also, 25 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
Like,
It's
so
better than the we're gonna try and fix this. Yeah.
right. Like it was exciting, right? But of course, since then, like we have continued to move forward a bit and say, okay, so like one, it turns out that there are other queer people other than white cis men. And like we can ask about their experiences and their relationships to different language cues. And also kind of disrupting this set of assumptions saying like, okay, well, there's straight guys and they sound masculine, and then there's gay
Hmm.
guys and they don't sound as masculine, right? Like we can really complexify this picture quite a bit.
But how quickly does that process of gender identification happen?
I don't think that we know, although the eye tracking study I was telling you about, the second half of that paper is looking at the effect of S, again, fronted S, on perceptions of masculinity. And just like with the race identification, it happens quite quickly. So within a second or less, people shape which faces they're looking at after they hear the more fronted version of S versus the less fronted version of S. They're picking up on that. Now that's not looking at that sort of generic identification the way we did with race, but it's still happening quite quickly. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know of any work that looks at how fast people are picking up gender from speech. I know that when they're looking at faces, they're very, very fast. So less than half a second. People are judging gender and race from faces, if I remember that literature. Yeah.
Gosh, so if you're trying to convince somebody you're a specific gender that you might not sound typically like, that's not a lot of time to work with.
Yeah. People are pretty fast at making the. It's hard to know what the actual set of dimensions are for like what people do this with, but I think the things that our culture acts like are that they're really important, right? Those are the ones that we learn
Hmm.
to do very quickly, because we sort of, growing up in the culture, we learn like, oh, these are really, really big pieces of information about somebody, and so it's sort of
Yeah.
worth working hard. And one of the consequences of that, of course, that we see with both gender and race is for people that are perceived as difficult to classify in those dimensions, that sometimes perceivers can respond to that as if they've sort of been done wrong in some way, right? Like, your existence is disturbing to me because my process, I'm used to being able to classify people within a half a second, and like if I can't do that, then my perceptual system sort of flags it as like, oh, we're having trouble here, right? And that can then uh people can respond quite badly, right? So Judith Butler has the whole conversation about intelligibility and sort of the ways that we pressure people into sort of requiring intelligibility. You must make sense to me, or you've sort of done something wrong, right?
That's so fascinating because you do see people react um in a very like the people have a lot of different reactions to misgendering somebody or having that sort of words, what I'm calling the words don't fit the picture problem, where they're
Yeah.
seeing something that doesn't necessarily align with what they're hearing. And yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes sense, because I do see sometimes reactions that kind of have that like, oh shit, something's wrong with my brain sort of feeling to them. Um, how important is voice compared to visual cues?
It depends. It depends, I think, on what people are doing. I do have a study not looking at gender, but looking at perceptions of foreign accent that suggests that if you tell people to ignore one or the other dimensions,
Mm-hmm.
um, part of what makes a difference is what they're supposed to be evaluating on. So we had them rating faces and voices for how good looking or how accented they thought the person was, right? So obviously there's a bias there where if I'm supposed to be rating how accented somebody is, then there's a better fit with voice than
Mm-hmm.
face, because with face, I'm having to rely essentially on racial stereotypes in order to
Right.
make that judgment. And then similarly with good looking, right? It sort of belongs to faces. So people are willing to do that rating on voice. But it doesn't isn't quite as sensible. And what we find is that they're in terms of what people are able to ignore when they're told that it's irrelevant information,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that the fit between the medium and the task matters, but also voices have an inherent advantage. So people were unable to completely ignore voices uh, when they were told to, but they were able to completely ignore faces in the task. So maybe that's a bias in favor, at least in that very sort of structured environment, that's suggesting that voices are more powerful. On the other hand, also voices are harder to ignore, right? Like if somebody is talking to me, it's for me to choose not to hear them, right? Whereas if somebody's in front of me, it's easier to choose not to look at them or to sort of not focus on their face. So it could just be a really basic perceptual pattern. I'm not really sure.
Oh, that's really interesting. So that study does, I guess, then suggest that it's harder to ignore the recognition or guesswork signals that you're getting from a voice than it is to ignore those that you're getting from a visual.
Yeah, I think so, because I think we have more control over our visual attention, but we are wandering into fields that are not mine, so I am speculating rather than rather than speaking from knowledge.
Let's come back to talking a little bit about these different features that can make voices sound different ways. Um, Obviously, we've talked about some of those physical differences, like structural differences, things that can be affected by testosterone. You mentioned S's and the pronunciation of those. What other levers can we pull to change how our voice comes across from a gender perspective?
It really, at that point, it really starts coming down to more culturally specific patterns, right? So, one of the big turns in language and gender research, maybe I want to say like 15, 20 years ago, was multiplying our concept of gender, and not in the way that has happened more recently, where more and more people have said, there's more than just men and women, right? But even before we sort of got there, just recognizing that within any given gender category, there's lots of different ways to be that gender, right? And so I think that's where, if somebody's being a particular gender, they're never just being that gender, right? They're being a lot of other things at the same time. They're racialized, and they have life experiences, and they have particular social goals, and they have communities that they belong to, right? And so the cues that we use to say, hey, I belong to this gender, they're always going to be mixed up with all this other stuff. So, really early on in the language and gender literature, many people would kind of locate that with Robin Lakoff's book, Language and Women's Place, which was this very sort of second wave of feminism look at gender, language and gendered sociolinguistics. And, she was really coming from a sort of academic, white, middle class perspective of what it meant to sound like a woman. And she put together this kind of list of features that she thought of as not only features that women used, but that women were policed into using, right?
Mm.
And so her big thing was, in the sort of mid 70s, right, this sense that women were expected to speak in particular ways, to use language in particular ways, but then they were also penalized for sounding that way, because many of the rules made sort of pushed in the direction of making your speech less effective or less assertive. So we were talking about swearing, right, earlier, and swearing or not swearing, right, is one of those kinds of examples of like women were not supposed to swear or were sort of penalized more for swearing. But Lakoff pointed out that there are some situations that really call for swearing. So she had this classic example of, oh, fudge, my hair is on fire, right? Like, doesn't really capture the moment, right? Like I'm sort of not expressing myself as effectively if I'm not allowed to swear, because some moments, like having your hair be on fire, is sort of a high emotion moment, and being sort of banned in some meaningful way from swearing kind of limits that. So she had a whole bunch of things that she thought of as classically women's language, but that were sort of self-limiting in some way. So hedging, so saying something like, um, that's, it's kind of nice out, right? These kinds of uh, limiting things, or tag questions, right? It's a nice day, isn't it? Right. So she sort of named these as features that women are expected to do, but then when women use them, they're sort of produced as evidence of like why women are unserious or sort of not really capable of engaging intellectually, because they say these silly things. Now, of course, there's been many critiques of Lakoff's discussion, right? Not least that she didn't actually work with data, right? She kind of was drawing on her own intuitions and those of her communities of what they think of as women's language, not necessarily how actual women were actually talking, but also probably more crucially that she didn't really dissect the other dimensions of identity that she was kind of assuming, right? So that's, I think, where things get very complicated, is that in different communities, what it means to be a man or a woman or any gender ends up looking different, right? Even stuff like who's supposed to be angry and who's supposed to be calm, not necessarily supposed to in a prescriptive way, but in a assumption of like what people's natures are, right? So there are absolutely communities where the assumption is that men are sort of inherently angry and women are a calming influence, and then there are other human cultures where the opposite is assumed, right? Where everybody kind of knows that women tend to be kind of angry and not in control of themselves, and men are the ones that are sort of calm and level-headed, and the ones that you need to bring the temperature of a situation down, right? So then the language features that you expect to see being gendered in those communities are going to be different, right? Because part of what is going to matter then is, well, what language features make you sound angry and what ones make you sound calm and like you're in control of things, right? So one of the things that I think we ultimately, a few decades on from Lakoff, started to realize was, or started to be able to spell out in research, is that you can't really talk about what language features have what relationship to gender without talking about what meanings have what relationship to gender, right? Because that's really where the action is. So you can do a study and you can say, oh, in this study, women say please and thank you more often than men, right? But that's not because please is like a female thing to say, right? It's because politeness means something and it's gendered in a particular way in this community, right? And please and thank you are ways of being polite. So you always have to look at those sort of intervening meanings. So one example is a colleague of mine, Sarah Benor. We were grad school together many years ago, and she was looking at a bunch of different language features in an Orthodox Jewish community, and she found that T release, so this question of what do you do with a T, particularly at the end of a word. So if we think of the word like hat, I can not release that T at all. So I can say hat, or I can release a little bit like hat, or I can have a really big burst like hat, right? So it's that T sound that you can kind of do different things with. And it turns out in the community she was looking at, having that T burst instead of just kind of ending without it was gendered, because it was associated in that community and in a lot of other communities in the English-speaking world with sounding educated or precise, something along those lines. But in that particular community, sounding educated or being educated wasn't just a general quality. It was associated specifically with studying Torah, which was a gendered activity. Only the men were doing that in that community.
Okay.
And so having a released T, which made you sound more educated, was kind of a way of saying, like, I really study Torah, like I'm a studier kind of person, right? And that was a way of being masculine, of sounding like a man in that community. But that's a very specific set of meanings, right? You couldn't even go, 2 blocks over in the same physical location, but in a different community, and expect those meanings to apply, because as soon as you're outside that Orthodox community, then you lose that chain of connection from sounding educated to sounding studious to studying Torah to being a man, right? Once you lose those intervening connections, it's no longer a gendered feature, right?
Okay. Yeah. No, I completely see that. I mean, when I started initially looking into this topic, I was like, gosh, it seems like there's no research on these specific questions I'm trying to answer. And now here I am, however long into it, and I'm going, oh, it's because they're impossible to answer. It's because there's no possible way we can ever untangle this stuff.
It is. It's very, very complicated because humans are complicated, right? And the meanings that we want to make about our world are complicated. So yeah, there's no easy way to get through it, unfortunately. Or fortunately, complication is fun sometimes.
Hey everybody, there's a lot still to come in this conversation, which you can find in the next episode of The Words Don't Fit the Picture. We're going to talk about exaggerated gender performance, code switching, how we adapt to using new pronouns for people in our lives, the future of translinguistics, and much, much more. Hopefully I'll see you soon for part 2. Thanks so much for listening.